In the spring of 1942, the Crimean Peninsula became one of the most contested regions on the Eastern Front. The battles that had begun during the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 had left the front lines stretching across southern Ukraine, with the Germans controlling much of the steppe, but the Soviets holding the strategic port of Sevastopol and the Kerch Peninsula in eastern Crimea. Both sides considered the region vital. For Germany, the Crimea offered a staging point for future advances into the Caucasus and secured the northern flank of Axis positions around the Black Sea. For the Soviet Union, holding parts of Crimea preserved a base for the Black Sea Fleet, threatened German access to the sea lanes, and tied down Axis divisions that might otherwise be sent to the central or southern sectors of the front. By the end of 1941, the Wehrmacht's 11th Army, under General Erich von Manstein, had captured most of Crimea, but the Red Army maintained two critical footholds: the fortress city of Sevastopol in the southwest and the Kerch Peninsula in the east. In December 1941, Soviet forces launched an amphibious counteroffensive across the Kerch Strait, landing multiple armies and regaining control of much of the peninsula. By early 1942, three full Soviet armies, the 44th, 47th, and 51st, were entrenched there, supported by the Black Sea Fleet. Their presence threatened German lines and offered a possible launching pad for renewed Soviet offensives toward the Dnieper Basin. For the Soviets, the Kerch bridgehead became a symbol of resilience and a vital operational base. Reinforced with men and materiel throughout the winter of 1941-42, the Crimean front under General Dmitry Kozlov grew to nearly 250,000 troops by May 1942. It included thousands of artillery pieces, tanks, and support from naval aviation. Soviet leadership believed the concentration of forces in the Kerch Peninsula would prevent a German breakthrough and might enable a counteroffensive to relieve Sevastopol. Moscow hoped that tying down German divisions in Crimea would also ease pressure on other sectors of the Eastern Front. For the Germans, the Soviet buildup represented a serious danger. The 11th Army, already heavily engaged at Sevastopol, risked being enveloped if Soviet forces broke out from the Kerch Peninsula. Yet Berlin also saw an opportunity. Hitler and the OKH, Army High Command, planned major operations for the summer of 1942, Fall Blau, the offensive toward the Caucasus oil fields. For this, the southern flank needed to be secured. Crimea, especially the Kerch Peninsula, had to be cleared quickly to eliminate the Soviet bridgehead and free up German divisions for the Caucasus advance. The condition of both armies reflected the larger strategic imbalance of spring 1942. The Red Army was numerically strong in Crimea, but poorly coordinated, with deficiencies in communications, mobility, and supply. Morale among Soviet soldiers was mixed, buoyed by numbers but undercut by memories of heavy defeats in 1941. German forces in the region numbered only around 150,000, but they had the advantages of better command cohesion, combat experience, and operational doctrine emphasizing surprise and concentration. The Luftwaffe's Fliegerkorps 8, commanded by Wolfram von Richthofen, provided crucial air support, capable of dominating local skies. Civilian populations in Crimea experienced the mounting tension in different ways. Many had already endured months of German occupation, with food shortages, requisitions, and reprisals shaping daily life. In the Kerch Peninsula, Soviet reoccupation after December 1941 brought new hardships, as homes and resources were commandeered for the war effort. Civilians were caught between two armies preparing for another decisive clash, facing bombardment, conscription, and the risk of forced evacuation. Thus, on the eve of May 1942, the stage was set for Operation Trappenjagd, known in English as Operation Bustard Hunt. For the Germans, it promised to resolve the Crimean stalemate with a rapid, concentrated offensive that would destroy Soviet forces in the Kerch Peninsula. For the Soviets, it was the test of their ability to defend a critical bridgehead and demonstrate that their winter counteroffensives could be sustained into the new campaigning season. Both sides were aware that the outcome in Crimea would have consequences extending far beyond the peninsula, shaping the broader campaign in southern Russia that year. On 8 May 1942, the German 11th Army launched its assault on the Kerch Peninsula, initiating Operation Bustard Hunt. Manstein's forces, though numerically inferior, relied on concentrated armor, overwhelming air superiority, and meticulous coordination between ground and air units. The attack began with a massive Luftwaffe bombardment. Richthoven's Fliegerkorps 88 committed hundreds of aircraft, including U-87 dive bombers and He-111 medium bombers, striking Soviet positions, supply depots, and communication centers. For hours, Soviet trenches, artillery sites, and rear areas were saturated with bombs, disrupting command structures and leaving frontline units vulnerable. On the ground, the Germans committed 3 corps: XXX Army Corps, X-3's Army Corps, and Eliv Army Corps. The main breakthrough effort was spearheaded by the 22nd Panzer Division and Romanian units supporting German infantry. Despite the terrain of the Kerch Peninsula, flat steppe with limited cover, German tactics focused on exploiting weak points in Soviet lines. Engineers cleared minefields while Stuka attacks suppressed defensive positions, allowing infantry to advance methodically. The Soviet defense under General Kozlov faltered almost immediately. Although the Red Army had nearly 250,000 men, supported by 1,200 tanks and over 1,000 artillery pieces, its deployment was rigid and poorly coordinated. Soviet command structures were heavily centralized, and communication lines had been shattered by the Luftwaffe bombardment. Frontline units often received contradictory orders or none at all, while reserves remained static, unable to maneuver effectively. The first day saw the collapse of Soviet forward positions near Marfovka and the breach of defensive belts. German armor pushed through gaps, while Luftwaffe aircraft maintained near-constant sorties, preventing Soviet counterattacks from forming. Soviet aviation, operating from Crimean airfields, attempted to contest control, but suffered heavy losses, with dozens of aircraft destroyed on the ground and in the air. By nightfall on 8 May, German spearheads had advanced more than 10 kilometers, capturing key positions and threatening to encircle Soviet forward armies. Initial Soviet reactions reflected confusion and misjudgment. Kozlov and his staff believed the German attack was limited in scope, perhaps a diversion from Sevastopol. Reinforcements were committed piecemeal rather than en masse, and counterattacks launched on 9 May failed under concentrated air and artillery fire. Soviet formations, such as the 44th Army, attempted to hold defensive lines along the Parpach Narrows, but German units achieved successive breakthroughs. By the second day, the Germans had taken thousands of prisoners and destroyed significant quantities of Soviet tanks. Civilian populations in the Kerch Peninsula were directly caught in the opening phase. Villages near the front lines were evacuated hastily, with many residents forced to abandon homes and livestock. Some civilians were conscripted into labor battalions, building fortifications that were quickly overrun. German forces, advancing through the steppe, commandeered resources, while retreating Soviet troops carried out scorched earth measures, destroying supplies that could not be moved. The impact on civilians was severe, with bombardments and crossfire leaving towns in ruins. The Soviet High Command in Moscow received alarming reports, but underestimated the speed of German advances. Stalin initially viewed the Kerch operation as a secondary effort, ordering that Sevastopol remain the priority. This misjudgment delayed reinforcements and adjustments. Meanwhile, Manstein pressed his advantage, pushing deeper into the peninsula, with the aim of cutting off entire Soviet armies from retreat. By the end of 9 May, it was evident that the German opening phase had achieved far more than a tactical penetration. Entire Soviet formations were in danger of encirclement, their defensive system collapsing under the combination of coordinated airstrikes, mobile armor, and disciplined infantry assaults. What began as a local offensive was rapidly unfolding into a large-scale disaster for the Soviet Crimean front. The stage was set for the encirclements and mass surrenders that would define the operation in the days ahead. The strategic goals and planning behind Operation Bustard Hunt highlighted the sharp contrasts in German and Soviet approaches to the Crimean theater in spring 1942. For the Germans, The operation was designed as a rapid, concentrated blow that would eliminate the Soviet Crimean front in a matter of days, thereby securing the eastern approaches to the peninsula and enabling full attention to be directed against Sevastopol. For the Soviets, the retention of the Kerch Peninsula was considered essential for maintaining pressure on German forces in Crimea, preserving a foothold for possible counteroffensives and demonstrating the capacity of the Red Army to recover from setbacks. The clash of these competing objectives set the stage for one of the most decisive battles of the war's southern sector. Erich von Manstein, commanding the German 11th Army, understood the precarious balance of his forces. His command numbered around 150,000 men, including German infantry divisions, the 22nd Panzer Division, and Allied Romanian formations. He knew that his army could not afford a prolonged battle of attrition against the Soviet Crimean front, which by May 1942 had swelled to roughly 249,800 men, supported by over 1,000 tanks and more than 1,000 artillery pieces. The German answer lay in concentration of force, combined arms coordination, and the use of tactical surprise. Manstein's plan relied heavily on the Luftwaffe to destroy Soviet defenses and prevent the movement of reserves, thereby creating gaps that German armor could exploit. The operation's code name, Trappenjagd, or Bustard Hunt, reflected the emphasis on speed and encirclement. Manstein's staff identified the Parpach Narrows, a 16-kilometer-wide stretch of steppe, as the critical sector where the Soviet front could be pierced. Once broken, German mechanized units could drive rapidly eastward, cutting off Soviet armies in the Kerch Peninsula and trapping them against the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. The aim was annihilation, not a gradual push. The timetable was short. Manstein expected the operation to last no more than 2 weeks, with decisive results in the first days. The Luftwaffe's Flieger Corps, the 8th, under General Wolfram von Richthofen, was integral to the plan. More than 700 aircraft were assembled, including Ju-87 dive bombers, Ju-88 and He-111 medium bombers, and Me-109 fighters. The air arms role was to destroy Soviet artillery, tank concentrations, and supply depots, while simultaneously isolating the battlefield by striking bridges, roads, and communication hubs. Richthofen emphasized precision and massed strikes, ensuring that Soviet defensive belts could be dismantled piece by piece. German air superiority was a prerequisite for the success of the ground offensive. On the Soviet side, the strategic vision was more defensive and politically driven. The Crimean front, under General Dmitry Kozlov, was tasked with holding the Kerch Peninsula at all costs. Stalin's Stavka considered Crimea a vital theater, both for its symbolic importance and for its potential as a springboard to liberate the peninsula. The Crimean front consisted of the 44th, 47th, and 51st Armies, reinforced by naval infantry brigades and supported by the Black Sea Fleet. Their plan emphasized static defense, relying on extensive trench systems, minefields, and artillery zones. However, Soviet doctrine in this sector was marked by rigidity, with limited ability to respond dynamically to breakthroughs. Logistics played a decisive role in shaping both plans. The Germans faced the challenge of sustaining mechanized and air forces across the narrow land bridge into Crimea, with supply lines stretching back through the Perekop Isthmus. Fuel and ammunition were stockpiled for the operation, but reserves were limited. Manstein's timetable was designed to minimize logistical strain, achieving a quick decision before supply shortages could hinder momentum. Soviet logistics, in contrast, were cumbersome but abundant in materiel. Supplies crossed the Kerch Strait from the Caucasus, where factories and depots provided a steady flow of tanks, artillery, and manpower. Yet distribution within the peninsula was hindered by poor infrastructure, and German air attacks repeatedly disrupted rear areas. Propaganda framed both sides' expectations. German communiques emphasized the necessity of clearing Crimea as part of the broader campaign to secure the southern flank for Fall Blau, the planned drive into the Caucasus and toward Stalingrad. Soviet propaganda depicted the Kerch bridgehead as a heroic stand, where the Red Army would hold firm and eventually launch an offensive to relieve Sevastopol. Soviet soldiers and civilians in the region were told that their defense would prevent the Germans from dominating the Black Sea and protect vital oil routes from Baku. Misjudgments were evident. Manstein underestimated the tenacity of Soviet resistance, but correctly assessed the weaknesses of their command system and coordination. Kozlov and the Stavka overestimated the strength of their defensive positions and underestimated the scale of the German offensive, interpreting early air raids as diversionary attacks. Soviet intelligence failed to predict the full concentration of German forces at the Parpach Narrows, leaving critical sectors underdefended. Thus, the strategic framework of Operation Bustard Hunt pitted German speed, coordination, and operational doctrine against Soviet numerical strength and defensive entrenchment. The Germans sought a rapid annihilation to secure their southern flank, while the Soviets aimed to hold ground as a base for future operations. The imbalance between planning and execution on each side would soon determine the outcome. When the first blows fell on 8 May, the clarity of German preparation and the vulnerabilities in Soviet organization became starkly apparent, propelling the operation toward its decisive course. The opening clashes of Operation Bustard Hunt on 8-10 May 1942 quickly revealed the effectiveness of German preparation and the vulnerabilities of the Soviet defense. The battle began before dawn with a concentrated Luftwaffe assault, one of the heaviest in the theater to date. Waves of Ju-87 dive bombers, escorted by Mi-109 fighters, struck Soviet artillery positions, ammunition dumps, and command posts. Medium bombers followed with saturation raids against rear areas and road junctions. Within hours, communications across the Soviet Crimean front were severely disrupted, leaving many units without clear orders. On the ground, the German 11th Army's LIV Army Corps spearheaded the initial push against Soviet lines at the Parpach Narrows. Infantry advanced behind rolling artillery barrages, supported by the 22nd Panzer Division. The Soviet 63rd Rifle Division, positioned in forward trenches, bore the brunt of the assault. Lacking adequate air cover, Soviet troops faced relentless bombing and strafing runs, followed by coordinated German infantry attacks. German pioneers cleared minefields under air cover, opening paths for tanks and armored vehicles. By midday, multiple breaches had been achieved, and German units were advancing several kilometers into Soviet territory. Soviet attempts to mount counterattacks on 9 May highlighted the disparity in coordination. Elements of the 44th Army and armored brigades were ordered to launch local offensives against the German breakthrough. However, these counterattacks were conducted piecemeal, often without artillery preparation or adequate reconnaissance. Luftwaffe dominance ensured that Soviet tank columns moving forward were intercepted and destroyed. Richthoven's air units claimed dozens of tanks in a single day, and German ground forces reported that Soviet counterattacks collapsed under combined air and artillery fire. The first major territorial shift occurred as German armor and infantry drove eastward, threatening to encircle Soviet divisions positioned near Marfovka and Arma Eli. Thousands of Soviet troops were cut off in pockets, many surrendering after ammunition and fuel ran out. By 10 May, German reports indicated more than 10,000 prisoners taken, along with large quantities of abandoned Soviet equipment, including tanks immobilized for lack of fuel. The rapid advance forced Soviet commanders to withdraw their lines hastily toward Kerch, abandoning fortified positions constructed over the winter. Civilians in the combat zone experienced the opening engagements as a sudden catastrophe. Villages on the Kerch steppe, previously under Soviet control, were evacuated in disorder, with families fleeing eastward alongside retreating troops. German and Romanian units advancing through these areas seized supplies, while Soviet forces destroyed infrastructure to deny resources to the enemy. The bombardment left settlements damaged or abandoned, adding to the dislocation of an already strained population. Morale diverged sharply between the two sides. German soldiers, accustomed to grinding attritional battles, were energized by the speed of their advance and the visible collapse of Soviet defenses. Soviet troops, despite numerical superiority, were thrown into confusion by the loss of command cohesion and the intensity of German air power. Reports from the Crimean Front headquarters reflected growing panic, as communication breakdowns meant entire divisions acted without direction, retreating or attempting local defenses that quickly crumbled. Unexpected outcomes also shaped the early days. While German planners had anticipated resistance lasting several days at the Parpach line, the speed of collapse exceeded expectations. Conversely, the Soviets misinterpreted the scale of the offensive, initially believing it to be a diversion from Sevastopol. This misjudgment delayed reinforcement and left vulnerable sectors exposed. By the evening of 10th of May, German spearheads had advanced up to 25 kilometers, and the Soviet Crimean Front faced the prospect of encirclement on a massive scale. The first engagements of Operation Bustard Hunt thus marked the decisive transition from planning to execution. German tactics of concentrated force, combined with overwhelming air superiority, broke through heavily manned but poorly coordinated Soviet defenses. Territorial gains, thousands of prisoners, and the disintegration of Soviet command structures all underscored the imbalance revealed in the opening phase. Within just 3 days, the Red Army's position in the Kerch Peninsula had been fatally compromised, setting the stage for the rapid escalation of the battle and the encirclement operations that would follow. As the German offensive in the Kerch Peninsula expanded between 11 and 14 May 1942, Operation Bustard Hunt entered a phase of rapid escalation that exposed the full scale of the Soviet crisis. Having achieved breakthroughs along the Parpach Narrows, German and Romanian units pushed aggressively eastward, seeking to cut off retreating Soviet armies and annihilate their capacity to resist. What had begun as a concentrated strike now threatened to engulf entire Soviet formations in a series of encirclements. The German plan unfolded with precision. Manstein's 11th Army, composed of LIV Army Corps, XXX Army Corps, and Ex-Syracine Army Corps, coordinated its movements to maximize pressure. LIV Army Corps exploited the breach created on 8 to 10 May, driving its infantry and armor eastward toward Kerch. XXXX Army Corps advanced on the southern flank, while X-Thor Army Corps and Romanian divisions applied pressure in the north. The 22nd Panzer Division, though relatively small, with fewer than 150 operational tanks, played a decisive role in penetrating Soviet lines, often supported by close air cover from Ju-87 dive bombers. The Soviet response was hampered by disorganization. General Dmitry Kozlov's Crimean Front still possessed over 200,000 men, but their deployment was fragmented. Soviet reserves, including tank brigades and rifle divisions, were committed in isolated counterattacks rather than as a coordinated force. On 11th May, the 47th Army attempted to launch a counterstroke with armored brigades near Arma Eli, but German air superiority proved decisive. Richthoven's Fliegerkorps 8 maintained nearly continuous sorties, destroying dozens of tanks before they could even reach the front. By the evening, the Soviet attack had collapsed, leaving wreckage scattered across the steppe. The scale of casualties rose dramatically. Between 11 and 12 May, German units reported capturing over 20,000 Soviet prisoners, along with large quantities of abandoned artillery and vehicles. Soviet losses in armor were particularly severe. Many tanks were either destroyed by air attack or immobilized by mechanical breakdowns and lack of fuel. German engineers dismantled captured equipment, while advancing infantry encountered columns of retreating Soviet soldiers cut off from supply and forced to surrender. Terrain and weather compounded the crisis. The flat expanses of the Kerch steppe offered little cover for Soviet forces, making troop movements highly vulnerable to air attack. German artillery could observe targets over long distances, and the Luftwaffe exploited clear skies to maximize effectiveness. Civilians caught in the steppe had no protection against bombardments, with many forced into improvised shelters or compelled to flee eastward toward Kerch. Villages along the German advance suffered extensive damage from shelling and bombing, further displacing local populations. By 12th of May, German spearheads had advanced more than 40 kilometers, threatening to cut off the retreat of Soviet forces positioned in the central and northern sectors of the peninsula. The 44th Army, heavily engaged on the southern front, faced encirclement as German and Romanian units closed in from multiple directions. Soviet command attempted to stabilize the situation by ordering withdrawals toward Kerch, but confusion and poor communication meant many units received orders too late. Columns of troops retreated under heavy attack from the air, sustaining devastating losses. Political tensions exacerbated the crisis. Stalin and the Stavka initially resisted Kozlov's appeals for retreat, fearing that abandoning the Kerch Peninsula would concede a vital strategic position. Orders were given to hold ground at all costs, resulting in futile counterattacks and unnecessary losses. Kozlov himself was increasingly marginalized, with Stavka representatives such as Lev Meklis intervening directly in command decisions. The insistence on rigid defense, combined with micromanagement from Moscow, paralyzed Soviet flexibility at the very moment when mobility was most needed. German reports from this period emphasized the extraordinary results of concentrated operations. By 13th May, Manstein's army claimed more than 60,000 prisoners taken since the start of the offensive, along with hundreds of artillery pieces and tanks destroyed or captured. While these numbers were exaggerated in German communiques, Soviet records confirm massive losses. In just 5 days, the Crimean front had been reduced by nearly half its effective strength. Morale diverged sharply. German and Romanian troops were buoyed by the speed of their success and the visible collapse of Soviet formations. Luftwaffe crews logged some of their most intensive missions of the war, with Richthofen personally noting the unprecedented density of targets. Soviet soldiers, by contrast, often found themselves surrounded, short of supplies, and without coherent orders. Many surrendered in large groups, while others attempted desperate breakouts toward Kerch. The escalation of Operation Bustard Hunt thus transformed the battle from a breakthrough into a near-complete collapse of the Soviet Crimean front. Within less than a week, German forces had advanced across most of the Kerch Peninsula, inflicting catastrophic losses and forcing a retreat toward the narrow approaches to Kerch itself. The scale of the crisis was now undeniable. Unless immediate reinforcements or a successful evacuation could be organized, the entire Soviet position in eastern Crimea risked destruction. Between 14 and 16 May 1942, Operation Bustard Hunt reached its peak intensity as German forces pressed their advantage and the Soviet Crimean front collapsed under the weight of coordinated attacks. The German 11th Army, supported by Romanian divisions and Fliegerkorps E8th, executed the encirclement on a vast scale, reducing Soviet resistance into fragmented pockets and driving survivors toward the port city of Kerch. The largest German operations of this phase were carried out by LIV Army Corps and XXX Army Corps. On 14th of May, LIV Army Corps pushed deep into the central Kerch Peninsula, advancing up to 20 kilometers in a single day. The 22nd Panzer Division, though short on tanks, functioned as a mobile spearhead, cutting Soviet escape routes and overrunning artillery positions. Meanwhile, XXX Army Corps advanced from the south, supported by Romanian units, driving back the remnants of the 44th Army. The maneuver threatened to close the encirclement around tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers still holding fragmented lines. The Luftwaffe intensified its role during this peak stage. Richthofen's corps flew more than 1,000 sorties over 2 days, striking retreating columns, bridges, and ferries across the Kerch Strait. Ju-87 dive bombers targeted Soviet artillery concentrations, while Ju-88 bombers pounded supply depots and evacuation points. Soviet aircraft attempted to intervene, but losses were heavy. On 15th of May alone, German claims listed over 40 Soviet planes destroyed in the air or on the ground, while German losses remained minimal. Control of the skies allowed German ground forces to operate with confidence, accelerating their encirclement operations. Casualties escalated dramatically. Between 14 and 16 May, German reports recorded an additional 70,000 Soviet prisoners taken. Many were encircled near villages such as Yenikale and Ajimushkai, where Soviet divisions, cut off from supplies, capitulated en masse. German figures may have overstated totals, but archival data confirms that the Crimean front lost more than 160,000 men during the operation, either captured or killed. Soviet tank brigades were almost entirely annihilated. Of more than 1,000 tanks deployed in early May, fewer than 150 remained operational by mid-month. Artillery losses were equally severe, with hundreds of guns abandoned. The suffering of civilians intensified as combat reached populated areas. Kerch, already heavily damaged from earlier battles and occupations, endured relentless bombardment. Thousands of residents attempted to flee across the Kerch Strait to the Taman Peninsula, but German air attacks sank ferries and small craft, killing both soldiers and civilians. Those unable to escape faced occupation once more, with German forces requisitioning food and supplies and Soviet rearguards implementing scorched earth measures. The Ajimushkai quarries, where civilians and soldiers sought shelter, became improvised fortresses that would resist long after the main battle ended, illustrating the desperation of the situation. The Soviet command structure collapsed under the strain. General Dmitry Kozlov struggled to maintain contact with his armies, while Lev Meklis, Stalin's political commissar, interfered with military decisions, demanding offensives when only retreat was possible. Stalin's orders to hold ground to the last man prevented a timely evacuation, ensuring that tens of thousands of troops were lost. Only small contingents managed to withdraw across the Kerch Strait under cover of night, ferried by naval craft of the Black Sea Fleet. Even these operations were costly, as German aircraft repeatedly attacked evacuation points. For the Germans, the peak of Operation Bustard Hunt represented one of their most decisive victories in 1942. In just over a week, Manstein's forces had destroyed an entire Soviet front, capturing vast quantities of weapons and securing the Crimean Peninsula east of Sevastopol. German losses were comparatively light, though not negligible. Several thousand casualties were sustained, particularly among infantry pressing encirclement battles. Romanian divisions, often tasked with holding flanks, also endured steady attrition. Yet the ratio of losses underscored the imbalance. Soviet forces had been virtually annihilated, while German formations remained intact for the next phase of operations. Strategically, the peak of the campaign freed Manstein to concentrate fully on Sevastopol, the last Soviet stronghold in Crimea. With the Kerch Peninsula cleared, the danger of a Soviet relief offensive was removed, and German planning for the assault on Sevastopol accelerated. For the Soviets, the destruction of the Crimean front created a void in the southern theater, forcing Stavka to divert resources from other fronts to stabilize the Caucasus approaches. The days of 14-16 May thus marked the zenith of Operation Bustard Hunt. The scale of German success, measured in territorial gains, prisoners, and destroyed equipment, was among the most significant of the Eastern Front's spring campaigns. At the same time, the devastation suffered by the Red Army revealed the consequences of misjudgments in planning, rigid command structures, and the failure to adapt under pressure. What remained of Soviet resistance in Crimea was reduced to isolated groups, with only Sevastopol left to carry the burden of continued defense. By mid-May 1942, the Soviet Crimean Front had ceased to function as a coherent fighting force. Yet isolated resistance and desperate measures emerged as remnants of armies attempted to adapt to the catastrophe of Operation Bustard Hunt. The Red Army, though shattered, did not immediately collapse into total surrender. Instead, fragmented formations, individual commanders, and civilians sought to continue resistance in improvised ways, while the Germans concentrated on consolidating their gains and preparing for the final destruction of survivors. The most striking episodes of adaptation came from groups that refused to capitulate after encirclement. At Ajimushkai, outside Kerch, several thousand Soviet soldiers, local militia, and civilians retreated into vast limestone quarries. Using the subterranean complex as shelter, they organized a defensive enclave. With limited supplies of food and water, these groups resisted German assaults for months, conducting sorties into surrounding areas for provisions. Although the quarries could not alter the outcome of the campaign, they symbolized the determination of isolated units to continue fighting even after the front had collapsed. Soviet military adaptation during these final days relied on improvisation. Small naval detachments of the Black Sea Fleet conducted evacuation operations across the Kerch Strait under heavy air attack. Destroyers, submarines, and smaller craft ferried troops and equipment to the Taman Peninsula, often at night to avoid detection. In total, around 140,000 personnel were evacuated, though many were wounded, disorganized, or without equipment. The evacuations preserved a portion of manpower, but left behind vast quantities of tanks, artillery, and vehicles that could not be transported. German forces, meanwhile, adapted their operations to exploit the disintegration of Soviet lines. Manstein directed his corps to tighten encirclements, emphasizing the capture of prisoners rather than prolonged battles. The 22nd Panzer Division executed rapid thrusts to block escape routes, while infantry divisions methodically cleared resistance pockets. The Luftwaffe shifted its missions from heavy bombardment of fortified lines to interdiction of escape routes and attacks on ferries. By focusing on mobility and air interdiction, the Germans minimized their own casualties while maximizing Soviet losses. Psychological strain affected both sides. Soviet soldiers, confronted with encirclement and lacking supplies, faced the grim choice of surrender, retreat, or fighting to the death. Many units, cut off from higher command, attempted independent withdrawals, but confusion and constant German air attacks turned retreats into routs. Morale collapsed in numerous formations, with thousands surrendering in groups. At the same time, instances of determined resistance like that at Ajimushkai revealed the persistence of Soviet resilience. For German troops, morale was high. Soldiers reported astonishment at the scale of Soviet capitulations, but the pace of operations demanded constant exertion. Infantry units covering long distances under intense heat and dust suffered fatigue, even as victories mounted. Civilian adaptation to the rapid shifts of control was equally critical. In Kerch, tens of thousands of residents attempted to flee with retreating Soviet troops. Many boarded overcrowded boats or clung to evacuation convoys, while others hid in quarries or forests. Families were separated in the chaos, with some members evacuated to the Caucasus, while others remained behind under renewed occupation. For those who stayed, adaptation meant enduring another period of German rule, with requisitions, forced labor, and reprisals against suspected collaborators or partisans. The Soviet High Command attempted to analyze the disaster even as it unfolded. Stavka representatives accused local commanders of incompetence, while survivors blamed political interference from commissars like Lev Meklis. Reports from evacuated officers described inadequate fortifications, poor coordination of reserves, and failure to concentrate armored forces effectively. Although these reports acknowledged bravery among individual units, they also underscored systemic flaws in planning and execution. The lessons drawn would shape later Soviet defensive doctrine, with greater emphasis on depth, mobility, and decentralized command. German adaptation extended to their political use of the victory. Propaganda emphasized the destruction of the Crimean front as proof of German superiority and as justification for future operations in the south. The scale of captured prisoners and equipment was presented as evidence of Red Army weakness. At the same time, Manstein stressed the need to redirect resources quickly toward Sevastopol, ensuring that momentum in Crimea was not lost. The ability to complete Bustard hunt within 2 weeks freed the 11th Army for its next major operation. By the final days of the battle, Soviet adaptation was reduced to survival. Units still fighting in the open were overwhelmed, their attempts at counterattacks shattered by air power. Those who escaped did so through night evacuations or by hiding in quarries and caves. German adaptation ensured that the operation remained short and decisive, preventing the Soviets from regaining a foothold. The resistance that persisted after mid-May was symbolic rather than operationally significant, but it demonstrated the persistence of Soviet will, even amid catastrophic defeat. Operation Bustard Hunt's phase of resistance and adaptation revealed the contrasts between a Wehrmacht exploiting initiative with flexible tactics and a Red Army forced into improvisation after systemic collapse. The Germans solidified control of the Kerch Peninsula while the Soviets salvaged what they could through evacuation and scattered resistance. For civilians, adaptation meant yet another cycle of occupation and survival under harsh conditions. This stage marked the final unraveling of organized Soviet defense, but also laid the seeds of lessons that would influence their conduct in later campaigns. The turning point of Operation Bustard Hunt came between 16 and 18 May 1942, when the Soviet Crimean Front effectively ceased to exist as an organized force, and the last Soviet hopes of maintaining the Kerch Peninsula collapsed. Unlike some battles where a single clash shifted momentum, the decisive moment here was cumulative. The steady encirclement, destruction of reserves, and paralysis of command that left Soviet armies unable to recover. By mid-May, the Germans had secured the initiative beyond doubt, and the remainder of the operation became a matter of eliminating isolated resistance and preventing large-scale evacuations. The most critical development occurred as German spearheads cut through the center of the peninsula, severing retreat routes to Kerch. Elav Army Corps advanced rapidly north and east, linking with XXX Army Corps pushing from the south. By 16th May, Soviet formations in the central sector were fully encircled, leaving tens of thousands trapped. Attempts by the 51st Army to mount a coordinated defense around the villages of Kamish-Burun and Ajimushkai failed under concentrated artillery and relentless air attacks. The Luftwaffe flew more than 500 sorties in a single day, hammering Soviet defensive positions and ferries on the Kerch Strait. With every passing hour, the possibility of orderly retreat diminished. For the Soviets, the turning point represented more than a battlefield defeat. It was the collapse of strategic options. General Kozlov's headquarters was in disarray, and communication with many frontline units was lost. Lev Meklis, the political representative of the Stavka, continued to issue contradictory orders, alternating between demands for counterattacks and calls for evacuation. The result was chaos. Some units dug in for futile last stands, while others attempted to withdraw without orders, only to be cut down by German airstrikes or captured by advancing infantry. The Crimean Front had begun May with nearly 250,000 men. Within 10 days, most were dead, wounded, or prisoners. German units exploited the situation with precision. The 22nd Panzer Division, though understrength, proved critical in sealing off escape routes. Mobile infantry groups from LEV and XXX Corps cleared pockets systematically, advancing under the umbrella of near-total Luftwaffe dominance. By 17th of May, more than 100,000 prisoners had been taken. Entire Soviet divisions disappeared from the order of battle, leaving only fragments capable of continuing the fight. The Germans reported capturing thousands of artillery pieces and destroying most Soviet tanks, confirming the annihilation of the Crimean Front as a functional force. Civilians experienced the turning point in ways that reflected both the desperation of the retreat and the brutality of the advance. In Kerch, tens of thousands crowded the port and beaches, hoping for evacuation across the strait. Naval craft of the Black Sea Fleet ferried troops and refugees to the Taman Peninsula, but German bombers relentlessly targeted embarkation points. On 17th May, several ferries were sunk, killing hundreds. Civilians unable to escape were left behind in a city under constant bombardment, facing the imminent return of German occupation. In rural areas, families were forced into hiding as combat swept across the steppe. Many sought refuge in quarries and caves, foreshadowing the long resistance that would continue underground at Ajimushkai. The psychological shift was stark. For Soviet soldiers, the realization that escape was nearly impossible led to mass capitulations. Units surrendered in entire battalion or regimental groups, often after exhausting ammunition. Others attempted desperate night marches toward the strait, leaving behind heavy equipment. For German troops, the turning point reinforced the sense of overwhelming superiority in operational art and air power, though commanders recognized that such decisive victories were exceptional and depended on specific circumstances of surprise, concentration, and opponent disarray. Internationally, the fall of the Kerch Peninsula carried immediate consequences. Soviet leaders in Moscow were forced to acknowledge the disaster, though official communiques minimized the scale of losses. The failure undermined Soviet attempts to portray their winter counteroffensives as a permanent reversal of German momentum. For Germany, the victory secured the eastern Crimea, eliminating the threat to 11th Army's rear and freeing resources for the coming assault on Sevastopol. Propaganda emphasized the capture of more than 150,000 prisoners as proof of Wehrmacht strength on the southern front. The turning point of Bustard Hunt thus marked the definitive conclusion of the campaign. The Soviet Crimean front was destroyed as a fighting force, its remnants reduced to survivors evacuated across the strait or hiding in underground shelters. German forces had achieved their goal with speed, securing the Kerch Peninsula in less than 2 weeks. For civilians, it meant the return of occupation and the trauma of bombardment and displacement. For the Red Army, it was a harsh lesson in the perils of poor coordination, rigid command, and underestimating enemy operational skill. By the night of 18th of May, organized Soviet resistance on the Kerch Peninsula was effectively over. Only scattered groups remained in hiding, and German troops prepared to consolidate their control. The strategic balance in Crimea had shifted decisively. Sevastopol now stood alone, isolated, and facing the full attention of Manstein's 11th Army. The breakthrough at Kerch had provided the Germans with a secure flank they required for further operations in the south, while for the Soviets it represented one of the most costly defeats of 1942. The turning point was complete, sealing the fate of the campaign. By 19th of May 1942, Operation Bustard Hunt had effectively concluded as a major combat operation. The final days were characterized not by organized battles, but by the systematic liquidation of isolated resistance, mass surrenders, and the evacuation of surviving Soviet forces across the Kerch Strait. For the Red Army, the aftermath of the operation was a disaster of immense proportions. For the Germans, it represented one of their most rapid and decisive victories of the year, achieved at relatively low cost. The retreat of the Crimean front had devolved into chaos by the time German spearheads entered Kerch. German and Romanian units swept into the city on 19th of May, encountering only scattered resistance. The urban fighting was brief, as most Soviet troops had already been captured or were attempting to evacuate. Yet the aftermath was grim. German troops reported tens of thousands of prisoners crammed into makeshift enclosures, many of them disarmed in mass surrenders on the outskirts of Kerch. Soviet losses in men, equipment, and material during the entire operation were catastrophic. Out of approximately 249,800 soldiers of the Crimean front, more than 170,000 were listed as captured, around 30,000 were killed, and only a fraction were successfully evacuated. German estimates, though often inflated for propaganda, still aligned broadly with Soviet archival data regarding the destruction of entire armies. The evacuation across the Kerch Strait continued into the night of 19th to 20 May, under desperate conditions. The Black Sea Fleet managed to withdraw around 120,000 to 140,000 troops, many of them wounded or disorganized, leaving behind the bulk of their equipment. German air attacks remained relentless. Ju-87 dive bombers struck ferries and small craft, sinking several and killing hundreds of soldiers and civilians. The waters of the strait became crowded with wreckage, bodies, and burning vessels. While a portion of Soviet manpower was saved, the ability of the Crimean front to function as a coherent force was destroyed. For civilians, the aftermath was severe. Thousands were stranded in Kerch and surrounding villages, unable to evacuate. Many were subjected once again to German occupation policies, which included requisitioning of food supplies, forced labor, and reprisals against suspected partisans. The Ajimushkai quarries became a symbol of civilian and military endurance. More than 10,000 people, including soldiers, workers, and families, retreated underground. There, they constructed improvised defenses and attempted to resist German assaults, living in extreme deprivation for months. Although German forces eventually reduced the resistance, the prolonged holdout underscored the desperate human dimension of the aftermath. German casualties in the operation were relatively modest compared to Soviet losses. The 11th Army reported around 7,500, 8,000 killed, wounded, or missing during the campaign, along with additional losses among Romanian units. Luftwaffe losses were limited to several dozen aircraft. The disparity reflected both German tactical advantages and the collapse of Soviet command and control. The contrast also shaped the narrative of the aftermath. While German soldiers celebrated a decisive success, Soviet survivors endured one of the most devastating defeats of the war's southern front. The destruction of the Crimean front had immediate military consequences. With the Kerch Peninsula secured, Manstein was able to concentrate his entire 11th Army against Sevastopol, which remained the last Soviet bastion in Crimea. German engineers began repairing captured infrastructure, while supplies and reinforcements flowed into positions around the fortress city. The Red Army, reeling from the loss of Kerch, rushed reinforcements to the Caucasus, fearing that the Germans would now have a clear path toward the oil fields. Stavka ordered investigations into the collapse, removing Kozlov and sharply criticizing the role of Lev Meklis, whose rigid interference had contributed to the disaster. Politically, the aftermath of Bustard Hunt strained Soviet morale. News of the defeat was downplayed in official communiques, which emphasized the heroic resistance at Kerch while omitting the scale of losses. Internally, the Stavka recognized that the loss of nearly 200,000 men in less than 2 weeks was a calamity that weakened Soviet positions in the south at a critical time. For the German High Command, the victory was exploited for propaganda purposes. Reports highlighted the capture of over 150,000 prisoners and thousands of tanks and guns, framing the operation as proof of German operational superiority. Humanitarian consequences were profound. The devastation of Kerch left much of the city in ruins, with infrastructure destroyed by bombardment and scorched earth measures. Food shortages grew acute as German forces requisitioned supplies, and civilians faced repression under occupation policies. Families separated during the evacuation often remained divided, with some members in the Caucasus and others trapped in Crimea. The psychological toll of repeated occupation, bombardment, and displacement deepened the suffering of the population. Thus, the aftermath of Operation Bustard Hunt was marked by extremes. For Germany, an operational triumph that secured the eastern Crimea and cleared the way for the assault on Sevastopol. For the Soviet Union, a crushing defeat that erased an entire front and forced painful reevaluations of doctrine and command practices. Civilians bore the brunt of destruction and reprisals, while survivors in quarries and evacuation routes embodied the resilience born of desperation. The Crimean Peninsula was once again firmly in German hands, and the consequences of this victory would reverberate in the months that followed. The legacy of Operation Bustard Hunt extended far beyond the immediate battlefield of the Kerch Peninsula, shaping both the course of the Eastern Front in 1942 and the historical memory of the war in Crimea. Militarily, it was one of the most decisive German victories of the spring campaigns. In just 12 days, Manstein's 11th Army and its Romanian allies eliminated an entire Soviet front, inflicted losses of over 170,000 captured and tens of thousands killed, and seized vast stockpiles of tanks, artillery, and supplies. The operation freed German forces from the threat of a Soviet counteroffensive in Crimea and allowed full concentration against Sevastopol, which would fall after a prolonged siege in June. For the Wehrmacht, Bustard Hunt was proof of the effectiveness of combined arms tactics, air superiority, and concentrated offensives executed with speed and precision. For the Soviet Union, the battle became a stark lesson in the consequences of poor coordination, political interference, and underestimation of enemy capabilities. The loss of the Crimean front exposed systemic weaknesses. Centralized command structures unable to respond quickly to battlefield developments, inadequate integration of armor and infantry, and over-reliance on static defenses vulnerable to concentrated air and ground assault. Stalin dismissed General Kozlov and reprimanded Lev Meklis, whose insistence on rigid defense contributed to the disaster. Yet the Red Army would learn from this defeat. By the summer and autumn of 1942, Soviet commanders increasingly emphasized depth, maneuverability, and improved coordination, changes that would bear fruit in later battles. The long-term significance of Bustard Hunt lay also in its strategic consequences. With the Kerch Peninsula secured, the German southern flank was protected, enabling Hitler to proceed with Fall Blau, the great summer offensive into the Caucasus and toward Stalingrad. The elimination of the Soviet foothold in Crimea gave the Germans temporary security in the Black Sea region. However, the apparent success masked deeper problems. The victory consumed resources and time, and it reinforced Hitler's belief that decisive operations could still annihilate Soviet forces wholesale. The pursuit of such encirclements in later campaigns, particularly at Stalingrad, would yield very different outcomes. For civilians, the legacy of Bustard Hunt was enduring trauma. Kerch, which had already suffered under German occupation in 1941, now returned to Axis control, and its population endured renewed hardship. Forced labor, requisitions, and reprisals shaped daily life, while the memory of mass evacuations, bombardments, and the underground resistance at Ajimushkai remained central to local recollections of the war. In Soviet post-war narratives, the quarries became a symbol of defiance, commemorated in memorials and literature as an example of sacrifice amid overwhelming odds. Historians continue to debate the broader significance of Bustard Hunt. Some view it as a tactical masterpiece of the Wehrmacht, demonstrating operational art at its peak. Others emphasize its limited strategic value, noting that while the Germans gained Crimea, they overstretched themselves in the Caucasus campaign that followed. Soviet historiography long portrayed the battle as both a tragedy of leadership failure and a testament to the endurance of ordinary soldiers and civilians. Western scholarship has highlighted both the scale of Soviet losses and the adaptability that would, in time, enable the Red Army to recover and reverse the tide. Commemoration of the battle varies. In Germany, Bustard Hunt receives little public attention, overshadowed by larger campaigns and by the eventual failure of the war in the East. In Russia and Ukraine, Kerch and the Ajimushkai quarries remain sites of remembrance, with memorial complexes dedicated to those who perished. For local populations, the battle is remembered not only as a military event, but as a lived catastrophe of occupation, evacuation, and survival. The historical significance of Operation Bustard Hunt lies therefore in its dual character: a short, decisive German victory that exemplified the strengths of their 1942 campaigns, and a devastating Soviet defeat that nevertheless became a catalyst for doctrinal reform and eventual recovery. It secured Crimea for the Axis in the short term, but did not alter the long-term trajectory of the war, in which Soviet resilience and industrial strength would prove decisive. The memory of Kerch, its destruction, and its resistance remains one of the enduring chapters of the war in the South, illustrating both the brutality of the conflict and the enduring human capacity to endure under extreme circumstances.